Howard Cosell truly hated him more than anyone. He called him a lightweight, a cheerleader in a suit, and once snapped on air, "I can't stand working with that man." This wasn't for show. This was real hate. Howard Cosell, the most feared voice in sports, wasn't afraid to destroy reputations. And the man he despised more than anyone wasn't a boxer, wasn't a coach. It was another broadcaster. Al Michaels. This is the story of how two men turned the broadcast booth into a battlefield, and how one of them never forgave the other. Before the fame, before the lights, before the feuds, Howard Cosell was Howard William Cohen. Born in 1918, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He wasn't born into television. He fought his way into it. Cosell grew up obsessed with truth, justice, and the power of words. He wasn't the kid throwing the football. He was the one arguing about how the game should be played. By the time he graduated from New York University and later NYU Law, he had something most broadcasters never did. A lawyer's mind. Sharp, analytical, ruthless. He knew how to break things apart, expose hypocrisy, and build an argument that no one could ignore. Before the camera, he stood in courtrooms defending athletes, young, broke, desperate to make it, against the powerful system that used them. That's where his empathy came from. He saw athletes not as entertainers, but as people crushed by business and politics. That's why when Cosell finally picked up a microphone in the 1950s to cover Little League Baseball for ABC Radio, it wasn't just about calling plays. It was about calling truth. And that voice, that unmistakable nasal East Coast growl, you couldn't escape it. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't polished. It was power. Cosell didn't narrate. He commanded. He didn't tell you what happened. He told you why it mattered. People had never heard a sports announcer sound like that before. He was arrogant, brilliant, and fearless, and he knew it. Audiences were split down the middle. Half loved him, half wanted him off the air, but no one could ignore him. And in television, that's not a weakness, that's a superpower. "They don't have to like me," Cosell once said. "They just have to listen." And they did. By the millions. When ABC Sports launched Monday Night Football in 1970, the network didn't just want announcers, they wanted personalities. They wanted chaos, charisma, controversy. They wanted Howard Cosell. Alongside Frank Gifford and Don Meredith, Cosell helped create something that had never existed before. Sports as national theater. Every Monday night, millions of Americans tuned in, not just to see touchdowns, but to hear Cosell. His booming commentary didn't describe the game, it dissected it. He turned every play into a debate about courage, discipline, and morality. While Gifford played the diplomat and Meredith cracked jokes, Cosell came armed with words like ammunition. He'd interrupt, argue correct, dominate. He wasn't there to be liked, he was there to educate. And he loved being the smartest man in the room. His presence electrified the booth and terrified his colleagues. Producers never knew what he'd say next. Athletes held their breath. Fans wrote angry letters. But Cosell didn't care. He was redefining what it meant to be a broadcaster, turning the role from entertainer to intellectual provocateur. He called out racism on air. He questioned fairness in sports long before it was fashionable. He said things others whispered, and said them loudly. One critic called him the man America loves to hate. Cosell smiled and said, "Good. At least they're talking about me." By the early 70s, Howard Cosell wasn't just part of Monday Night Football. He was Monday Night Football. The games were the excuse. He was the event. Before the feud, before the hate, before the headlines, there was Muhammad Ali, the fighter the world loved, and the man Howard Cosell understood. When the young, brash Cassius Clay first burst onto the boxing scene, most reporters laughed at him. They mocked his rhymes, his confidence, his mouth. But Howard Cosell didn't. He saw something. To Cosell, Ali wasn't a clown. He was a genius in gloves, a performer, a thinker, a provocateur, someone who used words as weapons, just like him. From their very first interview, it was lightning. Two egos, both massive, both brilliant, colliding on camera. Cosell would ask a sharp question, and Ali would fire back with charm, wit, and that disarming smile. It wasn't just boxing coverage, it was theater. Every exchange between them was a showdown of minds. But what started as TV magic turned into something deeper, mutual respect. When Ali refused the draft during the Vietnam War, the nation turned on him. He was stripped of his title, condemned as a traitor. Even many journalists abandoned him. But Howard Cosell didn't. He stood beside him on live television when it was dangerous to do so. Cosell said, "He's entitled to his beliefs. That's what this country stands for." That moment was more than solidarity. It was rebellion. Cosell wasn't defending a boxer, he was defending principle. He knew the backlash was coming, and he didn't care. Because that's who Howard Cosell was, a man who'd rather be hated for truth than loved for silence. Over the years, their friendship became one of the most fascinating relationships in sports history, a loud, funny, fiercely loyal bond that crossed lines of race, religion, and fame. When Ali called himself the greatest, Cosell didn't laugh. He agreed. And when Ali fell from grace, Cosell didn't vanish. He stayed. It wasn't perfect. They argued, they performed, they entertained millions. But underneath the spectacle, there was trust. They needed each other. Ali gave Cosell relevance. Cosell gave Ali legitimacy. Together, they made sports cultural history. They didn't just talk about fights, they talked about America. Race, politics, pride, humanity. It was two men in front of the world, daring to be real on camera. And in a time when most broadcasters hid behind neutrality, Cosell stood in the fire, because that's where the truth lived. But being honest in public comes with a cost. And for Howard Cosell, that cost was everything. By the late 1970s, Cosell had become more than a sportscaster. He was a lightning rod. Every time he spoke, the phone lines at ABC exploded. People either adored him or wanted him fired. He'd criticize referees, expose athlete scandals, question the NFL itself. To most announcers, that was suicide. To Cosell, that was Tuesday. He wasn't afraid to go after anyone. Team owners, coaches, networks, even the league that made him famous. He believed that sports were a reflection of society, greed, inequality, racism, and if no one else would say it, he would. "My job," he said, "isn't to cheer. My job is to challenge." That philosophy made him a pioneer and a pariah. The more honest he got, the more enemies he made. He feuded with athletes who couldn't handle his criticism. He clashed with executives who wanted him to lighten up. And he got hate mail by the thousands. People called him arrogant, pompous, self-righteous. But behind that loud voice was a man who cared too much. He saw the industry he loved, sports journalism, turning into entertainment, into hype. And it broke his heart. He said, "We're not reporters anymore. We're promoters." That was the line that turned networks against him. Cosell was no longer the golden child of ABC. He was the problem, the guy who said too much, who couldn't be controlled. Yet he refused to play it safe. He believed that if you don't anger someone, you're not telling the truth. Behind the scenes, the pressure was crushing him. His marriage to Mary Emmy Abrams was his only escape. She was his calm, his grounding force. But on air, the world saw only the tough shell. Howard Cosell, the arrogant genius who never shut up. By the early 80s, the network wanted smoother voices, cleaner faces, safer broadcasts. Cosell wanted honesty. They wanted comfort. He gave them confrontation. And that's when the real war began. Not with the NFL, not with the audience, but with another broadcaster who represented everything Cosell despised, Al Michaels. Behind the booming voice, the sharp tongue, and the storm of controversy, there was peace. And her name was Mary Emmy Abrams Cosell. Most people never saw her. She wasn't on camera, she didn't seek fame. But make no mistake, without Emmy, there would be no Howard Cosell. They married in 1944 in the middle of World War II, when the future of the world, and their own, was uncertain. Howard was still a young attorney then, grinding through New York courtrooms, defending minor league athletes for pennies. Emmy stood beside him, steady and patient, even when the rent was late and the phone barely rang. She was everything he wasn't, calm, graceful, quietly confident. While Howard fought the world, Emmy kept his world standing. As his fame exploded, so did the chaos. He became one of the most recognizable voices in America, praised one moment, crucified the next. TV executives called him brilliant one week, impossible to work with the next. But through it all, Emmy was his anchor. She'd listen when he came home fuming after a broadcast fight, or when another newspaper called him the most hated man in sports. She'd pour him a drink, look him straight in the eye, and remind him, "Howard, you don't have to be loved. You just have to be right." It sounds small, but it was everything. Because Howard Cosell wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing truth. And Emmy was the only one who truly understood that mission. Their marriage lasted 46 years, a lifetime in an industry built on ego and burnout. When he traveled for Monday Night Football, she wrote him letters. When he took heat for defending Muhammad Ali, she told him to hold the line. They weren't just partners, they were a fortress. But in 1990, tragedy hit. Emmy passed away. Howard's colleagues noticed it instantly. The swagger dimmed. The spark faded. The man who'd fought the world suddenly had no fight left. He once said in private, "I've battled everyone. The leagues, the networks, the public. But Emmy, she was the only one who ever made me feel safe." After her death, Howard began to withdraw from public life. The booth didn't feel the same. Without Emmy, the fire that fueled him was still there, but the warmth was gone. The legend the world saw was loud, proud, and untouchable. But the man behind closed doors was heartbroken, haunted, and utterly alone. And when he did return to the booth, there was one man waiting for him. A colleague whose style, charm, and popularity represented everything he now despised. His name was Al Michaels. If there was ever a man who could get under Howard Cosell's skin, it was Al Michaels. The network called it a dream pairing. Two professionals, two icons, two masters of their craft. But the moment they sat beside each other, it was war. Cosell saw Michaels as everything wrong with modern broadcasting: polished, agreeable, perfectly corporate. He used to say, "The man's a cheerleader in a suit. He narrates, he doesn't analyze." That was the ultimate insult from Howard Cosell, because for him, broadcasting wasn't about sounding good. It was about being honest. Al Michaels, on the other hand, saw Cosell as outdated, a relic from a time when broadcasters thought they were philosophers. He once told a colleague, "Howard thinks he's the only one in the room with a brain. He doesn't understand restraint." Their chemistry on air was volcanic. Cosell's deep, commanding voice would dominate the booth, cutting off Michaels mid-sentence. Michaels would grit his teeth, finish his line, and pretend nothing happened. Viewers at home could feel the tension. It wasn't a broadcast, it was a boxing match with microphones. And ironically, people loved it. The tension made the show unpredictable. Would they argue? Would Cosell explode? Would Michaels snap back? Audiences couldn't look away. But behind the cameras, it was pure hostility. Production meetings turned into shouting matches. Cosell accused Michaels of being network wallpaper, a man too afraid to offend anyone. Michaels fired back, calling Cosell an egomaniac who couldn't share oxygen. Crew members whispered that sometimes, after a blow-up, the room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, until the red camera light blinked on, and both men instantly became professionals again. The hatred wasn't just personal. It was philosophical. Cosell believed in journalism, raw, honest, confrontational. Michaels believed in storytelling, smooth, emotional, safe. Two visions of sports broadcasting colliding every single night. Years later, Cosell would still seethe about him in interviews. He'd wave his hand dismissively and say, "He'll be remembered for one line in Lake Placid. I'll be remembered for changing how America talks about sports." And that's the thing about Howard Cosell. His grudges weren't petty. They were principled. He didn't hate Al Michaels for being talented. He hated what Michaels represented, the corporate, commercial face of a profession he'd spent his life trying to elevate. To Cosell, Michaels wasn't the enemy. He was the end of an era. A sign that truth was losing to entertainment, that courage was losing to comfort. "I didn't want to be liked," Cosell once said. "I wanted to be heard." And when he looked at Al Michaels, he saw the opposite, a man who made everyone comfortable. Howard Cosell didn't do comfortable. He did real. Even decades later, the resentment never faded. When someone mentioned Michaels' name, Cosell's eyes would harden. He'd sneer, change the subject, or deliver a single cutting line that silenced the room. It wasn't rivalry anymore. It was contempt, born from two men who stood for completely different worlds. One wanted applause, the other wanted truth. And that's why, for the rest of his life, Howard Cosell would say it plainly: "Al Michaels is the one man I truly, deeply hated." By the late 1980s, Howard Cosell had become something America had never seen before, a man both too big to ignore and too bold to control. But time was catching up with him. The networks were changing. The world of sports journalism, the one he built, was being replaced by something he didn't recognize anymore. Gone were the confrontations, the honesty, the moral fire. In their place came smiles, slogans, and soft interviews. Everything was marketable. Everything was safe. And Howard Cosell was neither. He had spent decades demanding that sports be taken seriously, that athletes be seen as people, not props. But now the networks only wanted cheerleaders with microphones, and Cosell refused to play along. He'd go live on air and say the things others whispered in private. He'd call out hypocrisy, greed, and corruption right in front of the sponsors. It was career suicide. But Howard didn't care. He wasn't in it for comfort. He was in it for truth. Then came 1983, the moment everything cracked. During a Monday Night Football broadcast, he used a phrase to describe a player that many perceived as racially insensitive. The backlash was instant and brutal. Cosell, who had defended black athletes for decades, who had risked his reputation for Muhammad Ali, suddenly found himself labeled a racist. He was crushed. He said privately, "After all I've done to fight prejudice, this is what they think of me." It wasn't just public criticism, it was betrayal. The very media that had once celebrated him now turned their knives. Executives distanced themselves. Friends went silent. For the first time in his career, Howard Cosell was truly alone. He left Monday Night Football soon after, walking away from the empire he'd helped create. He released his final book, I Never Played the Game, a blistering attack on the industry that had, in his eyes, sold its soul. In it, he called out corruption, cowardice, and the growing emptiness of modern broadcasting. He didn't hold back. He never did. And that's why the book made him both a hero and a target. To some, it was the greatest act of defiance in television history. To others, it was proof that Howard Cosell had finally gone too far. But to those who truly understood him, it was his final act of truth. A man raging against the dying of integrity in an industry built on image. And as the lights faded, so did he. He began to disappear from TV. His health worsened. His heart slowed. His voice, that once commanded the nation, grew quiet. The loudest man in America was falling silent. When Howard Cosell passed away in 1995 at the age of 77, America didn't just lose a broadcaster, it lost a conscience. There was no one like him before, and there hasn't been anyone like him since. In his final years, he'd become a symbol, both loved and loathed, of what journalism used to mean. He believed in honesty over popularity, in truth over comfort, in journalism over show business. At his funeral, reporters, athletes, and even former rivals showed up in silence. Muhammad Ali, frail from Parkinson's, stood among them. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all: gratitude, respect, and loss. For decades they had fought, laughed, and performed together. But underneath the theatrics was something deeper: brotherhood. Cosell had defended Ali when no one else would, and Ali never forgot that. And as the cameras rolled one last time, people realized something. Howard Cosell hadn't just covered sports, he had changed them. Before Cosell, sportscasters were cheerleaders. After Cosell, they were storytellers. Before him, athletes were just heroes or villains. After him, they were human beings. He forced America to look at the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. He made people think, argue, feel. He made sports matter. Even Al Michaels, years later, would admit in an interview, Howard was difficult, yes, but he raised the bar. Whether we liked it or not, he made all of us better. That's the thing about revolutionaries. You don't appreciate them until they're gone. And by then, it's too late to tell them they were right. Today, when you turn on the TV and see broadcasters talking about social issues, athlete activism, or the politics behind the game, that's Howard Cosell's fingerprint. His voice echoes in every journalist who dares to ask the hard question, who refuses to play nice just to stay liked. I never played the game, he once said, but I changed how it's played. And he did. Howard Cosell didn't just narrate history, he challenged it. He stood toe-to-toe with champions, presidents, and corporations, and never blinked. He fought for truth, and he paid the price for it. But here's the twist. Even his enemies couldn't forget him. Because you can ignore a commentator. You can't ignore a force of nature. And that's what Howard Cosell was. Loud, flawed, brilliant. The man America loved to hate, but could never stop listening to. After Howard Cosell's death, something strange happened. The man who had been mocked, hated, and silenced began to sound more right than ever. The same sports media that once called him arrogant now quoted him with reverence. clips of his fiery monologues, the booming nasal voice that once divided America, started trending again. New generations who'd never seen Monday Night Football were suddenly asking, who was that guy? Why does he sound so real? And that's the thing, Howard was real. Brutally, painfully, refreshingly real. He wasn't a character, he wasn't a media puppet. He was raw humanity with a microphone. Even decades later, journalists began to realize something that shook them. Howard Cosell had predicted the future. He warned that sports would become corporate entertainment, that athletes would turn into walking endorsements. That commentary would lose its teeth, because controversy doesn't sell as well as comfort. Every word of that came true. Today, turn on any sports show and you'll see the world Cosell feared. Endless highlight reels. Smiling hosts who never say anything that might offend. The edge, the integrity, gone. But Howard? He was the opposite. He wanted to offend, not for fame, but for truth. He believed the job of a broadcaster wasn't to please, it was to challenge. In a way, Howard Cosell became more alive after he died than when he was on air. His words became prophecies. His interviews with Muhammad Ali became cultural relics, moments when sports and society collided with purpose. And for those who study the media today, he's a blueprint. The courage, the controversy, the conviction. A man who knew that fame fades, but truth echoes. Even Al Michaels, the man he despised, once admitted years later in a podcast interview, "I think about Howard a lot. The guy drove me insane, but he was fearless. I'll give him that. He didn't care who he pissed off. And maybe that's what made him great." There it was, the final, reluctant respect from his greatest rival. Cosell might have hated Michaels, but deep down, Michaels knew. You don't hate someone that much unless, on some level, you envy them. And maybe that's why the legend of Howard Cosell endures, because no one since has dared to take his place. If you walk through a West Hampton cemetery today, you'll find a small, unassuming headstone. It doesn't scream fame, it doesn't list awards, accolades, or titles. It just says, Howard William Cosell, 1918 to 1995. No spotlight, no microphone, no roaring crowd, just quiet. And yet, that silence might be louder than any broadcast he ever gave, because every time a commentator asks a tough question, every time an athlete refuses to stick to sports, every time a broadcaster risks their career to tell the truth, Howard Cosell lives again. He became more than a voice. He became a principle. To be honest when it's inconvenient, to be brave when it's unpopular, to be loud when silence is the easy way out. Howard Cosell never played the game, but he changed how it was played, forever. He didn't care if you loved him or hated him. He cared that you listened. And America did. From Muhammad Ali, who once called him the only white man I trust, to Al Michaels, who once called him the man I couldn't stand, every one of them, whether they admitted it or not, carried a piece of Howard with them. He was the spark in a sterile industry, the voice that made silence impossible, the conscience that made comfort feel dishonest. And that's the paradox of Howard Cosell. He was both the most hated and the most necessary man in sports. He wasn't here to make us feel good. He was here to make us think. And that's why, decades later, we still talk about him. When the camera fades and the commentary ends and the final whistle blows, you can still hear it. That sharp, unmistakable voice echoing in the distance. I tell it like it is. And that's exactly what he did, no matter who hated him for it.
If you enjoyed this story, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It really makes us smile. And if you're hungry for more fascinating tales, check out the 2 videos right below. You might just discover your next favorite story.